Welcome back to the conversation about the Respect for Persons principle. In this mini lecture, we're going to be focusing on the principle itself. In a moment, I'll be reading parts of the historical text of the Belmont Report, and I invite you as I listen to listen actively for the basic idea, for what's involved in thinking through the Respect for Persons principle, what may be difficult, and what is next. What kind of heuristic could we use to think through future situations? And again, the Belmont Report is available online, and the text I'm reading can be reached from this particular link. Respect for persons incorporates at least two ethical conditions. First, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and second, that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. The principle of respect for persons thus divides into two separate moral requirements: the requirement to acknowledge autonomy and the requirement to protect those with diminished autonomy. An autonomous person is an individual capable of deliberation about personal goals and of acting under the direction of such deliberation. To respect autonomy is to give weight to autonomous persons' considered opinions and choices while refraining from obstructing their actions unless they are clearly detrimental to others. To show lack of respect for an autonomous agent is to repudiate that person's considered judgments, to deny an individual the freedom to act on those considered judgments, or to withhold information necessary to make a considered judgment when there are no compelling reasons to do so. However, not every human being is capable of self-determination. The capacity for self-determination matures during an individual's life, and some individuals lose this capacity wholly or in part because of illness, mental disability, or circumstances that severely restrict liberty. Respect for the immature and the incapacitated may require protecting them as they mature or while they are incapacitated. Some persons are in need of extensive protection, even to the point of excluding them from activities which may harm them. Other persons require little protection beyond making sure they undertake activities freely and with awareness of possible adverse consequence. The extent of protection afforded should depend on the risk of harm and the likelihood of benefit. The judgment that any individual lacks autonomy should be periodically reevaluated and will vary in different situations. So that was the first 4 paragraphs of the Respect for Persons. I didn't read a 5th paragraph that you're invited to read online. So what was the basic idea of what you just heard? What did the text suggest is involved in thinking through the Respect for Persons principle? What might be difficult? And what's next? How would we move forward? So before we unpack those questions, I want to turn also to the informed consent part of the Belmont Report. The informed consent piece is directly tied to the Respect for Persons. And I will read a small portion of the informed consent piece and also make comments about the rest of the text. And again, listen for the basic idea of what's involved, what's difficult, what's next. Informed consent. Respect for persons requires that subjects, to the degree that they are capable, be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them. This opportunity is provided when adequate standards for informed consent are satisfied. While the importance of informed consent is unquestioned, controversy prevails over the nature and possibility of an informed consent. Nevertheless, there is widespread agreement that the consent process can be analyzed as containing 3 elements: information, comprehension, and voluntariness. In the rest of the text, the description of information, voluntariness, and comprehension are explained. In terms of information, the discussion has to do with what is sufficient information, highlighted here, whether there's a standard for what should be included, and what happens when there's an aspect of the research that you shouldn't really provide to participants before they start because it might impair the validity of the research. In terms of comprehension, the point is that the manner and context in which information is conveyed is as important as the information itself. In other words, the person getting the information needs to understand it. The text points out it's necessary to adapt the information based on who you're talking to. And there's a difficulty when the comprehension is severely limited, trying to figure out how you give information to different populations. The final component of informed consent is the issue of participation being voluntary, and that valid consent is only when it's voluntarily given. The consent needs to be free of coercion and undue influence. There's a gray area, though, as the text discusses, where persuasion ends and influence begins. So where is that line? So that illustrates the original historical text of Respect for Persons and a bit of the text of Informed Consent. And I encourage you to read the original text online to more completely understand it. But now I will unpack the basic idea, what's involved, what's difficult, and what's next. So what is the basic idea? So hopefully you're hearing the notion of acknowledging autonomy, and autonomy being the central piece here. An autonomous person is somebody who's capable of deliberation, capable of decisions about personal goals and acting accordingly. So an autonomous person can make decisions for themselves. There's the obligation to protect those with diminished autonomy, where the text points out the capacity to make such decisions for self-determination matures as kids get older and turn into adults. And some individuals lose the capacity to make decisions because of illness, disability, circumstances. So there's the obligation to acknowledge autonomy and the obligation to protect those with diminished autonomy. And this notion of respect for persons in this way goes beyond a dictionary sense of respect. We're not talking about a general form of admiring, but rather a focus on respecting autonomy. This issue is a more actionable issue than everyday respect. I might respect you in particular ways, but not necessarily have an obligation to do anything, to take action. But here, you're supposed to take action. And respect, we might debate, but respect could be considered optional. But respect for persons in the Belmont Report is not optional. So what's involved? How do we go about thinking through the respect for persons principle with specific situations? So part of it is trying to figure out who the persons are, what persons are involved. And then of the people, of the persons, do they include those with autonomy, those who are capable of making their own decisions? And or do they include those who have diminished autonomy? Are there young individuals who are immature or people who don't have the capacity anymore to make their own decisions? So we need to figure out which people are involved. And we can think about what happens next in terms of these verbs. So we're characterizing the people who are involved. And if they have autonomy, then we acknowledge their autonomy by supporting informed consent. If the people have diminished autonomy, then we protect their diminished autonomy by either denying the decision-making and excluding or delegating their decision-making to someone else. In order to get a better sense of what this looks like, we can turn to a flowchart format. Starting at the top, the same information represented differently. We're characterizing who's involved. If who's involved, the person has autonomy, we go down the left path to the issue of acknowledging their autonomy and supporting informed consent. If the persons that are involved include those with diminished autonomy, then we go down the right path to the protect state, where we might deny them and exclude them from participating or delegate their decision-making to someone else. We might delegate to a parent the decision-making for a child. And then when we do that delegation, then that person, the delegate, has to go through the informed consent process. And over on the far left again, with informed consent, we see that that comes down to thinking about the information to be communicated, understanding how to make that information comprehensible, and ensuring that the consent is given voluntarily. So what might be difficult about these procedures, these activities? So here are a few examples. We start with difficulty in characterizing. Often there are many people involved in research or design activities and trying to figure out who they might be and trying to figure out what's required of them and their level of autonomy is not always straightforward. If we go down the right-hand path, the issue of protecting diminished autonomy, do we deny or delegate? There can be tension there. The support of informed consent is challenging. In fact, the original text pointed out that it's challenging. Trying to figure out what information is needed and when is too much and what's sufficient, making it comprehensible, and ensuring voluntary consent all have difficulties associated with them. So the entire box there is shown in red. And then there's an additional piece called reconcile that I've added, pointing out that at times it's difficult to know whether the person is autonomous or has diminished autonomy. Say, for example, a 17-year-old who actually has graduated from high school, who might be considered a minor who needs protection, but also an adult going off to college who has autonomy. Or somebody who has dementia, where the dementia shows up on particular days and other days not. So on the days with dementia, clearly there's a need to protect diminished autonomy. But when the dementia is not active, then we might assume that the person has autonomy. How do we reconcile these things? I don't have an answer, just pointing out that it can be difficult. So what's next? Where do we go here with this list of ideas and this flowchart? So here, I've put the diagram, the flowchart over here on the right, but on the left, the quick reference, what we need to think through, characterizing the people. If they're people with autonomy, we acknowledge the autonomy by supporting informed consent. If they have diminished autonomy, we protect them by delegating or denying participation. And if there's tension between autonomy and not autonomous, then we have to figure out how to reconcile these two states. So in the next mini lecture, we will talk about applying these concepts to a variety of research examples.